Well, without hesitation, as tensions between Russia and Ukraine escalated to a full invasion by Russian forces, world markets reacted sharply. And due to the nature of today's global economy, U.S. ag markets quickly followed suit. Joining us to talk more about the implications for Ohio agriculture and U.S. agriculture as a whole is Dr. Ian Sheldon. He's a professor and Anderson's Chair of Agricultural Marketing, Trade, and Policy at Ohio State's Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics. Dr. Sheldon, thank you so much for taking time for us today.
No, you're welcome. Glad to be here. It's not really the kind of thing I want to get out of bed on a Thursday morning to find out what's happened in Ukraine, which obviously is a very worrying and scary sort of prospect for the world. But I'm not surprised that you called me, and there are obviously some things that we can talk about, or at least try to forecast what might happen.
Let's set the stage first, if you will. How do Russia and Ukraine fit into agriculture on a global scale?
Well, between the two of them, Russia and Ukraine account for about 29% of global wheat exports. That's probably the most important commodity that they're trading. But Ukraine also produces barley and rye, which they typically export to Europe, to the other parts of Europe. But importantly, if you follow corn markets, many people might know that Ukraine actually turned out to be a very important exporter of corn to China last year. As you know, the US benefited tremendously from corn exports to China in 2021 and to some extent in 2022, but Ukraine started to sort of flex its muscles there. And, as far as I understand it, China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, has really been focusing on diversifying some of its import supplies, particularly for corn, and Ukraine in particular is an important potential supplier of corn. So that's where I think, and beyond, of course, explicitly agricultural commodity markets, the fact that Russia, of course, is a major supplier of natural gas and has been for some time, and natural gas is an important input into fertilizer production. So I think we can see things happening on the input side as far as agriculture is concerned, and things happening on the commodity export side and international trade side.
As you and I talk, it's still very fresh news. The market's still trying to consume what's happening and put it into numbers. We saw overnight the commodity markets here in the U.S. spike higher, limit up in most cases. And as we talk now, soybeans are back down. So the market's still trying to figure their way through this on a U.S. and global scale. What are you watching in the markets and outside of the markets that our members and farmers across the state should be concerned about?
Well, I think this is potentially a double-edged sword for farmers in the United States and in Ohio in particular. Given that our commodity economy here in the state is mostly based on corn and soybeans, corn prices were heading up before the invasion actually happened. I looked at the Chicago prices on 2 days ago, and they were already moving up. And I think if you want to see a good side to this for American exporters, if the world corn price goes up, then that's potentially beneficial to Ohio corn farmers. Remember, our number one export from the state is actually soybeans, and so I don't see. As I understand it, Ukraine does produce some oil seeds, but I don't think it's a particularly significant supplier compared to Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. I think Latin America is our major competitor with respect to oil seeds, but for sure, corn they're important competitors. And so I think we're going to see corn prices firm up and remain firm, especially if the invasion actually, the Ukrainian harvest obviously hasn't happened yet. But if this leads to major destruction of farmland, or the inability of farmers to bring corn to harvest, and of course a lot depends on how Russia treats any exports leaving Ukraine, and of course a lot will depend upon the nature of and the extent of sanctions against Russia and how that might impact agricultural commodity flows. I mean, right now, at least based on what my home country has been doing, it's mostly targeting Russian oligarchs and Russian banks operating out of London, and so it's focusing on financial sanctions. But who knows where those sanctions are going to lead as the US, the EU, and other countries coordinate their response and ratchet up that response to what's happening. So I think on the corn side, I would suggest that, if we hate to benefit from other people's pain that's happening, as the invasion takes place, but I think it's going to help exports of corn from the United States and certainly prices on the world export market. Now I guess we're not particularly large wheat producers in the state, but wheat prices have been pretty firm even before this happened, and that was mostly being driven by what happened in Canada last summer with very dry conditions, very hot conditions led to a poor Canadian wheat crop, and so wheat prices have been pretty firm even before talk of the invasion began. And again, I looked at the Chicago futures price again back on February the 22nd, and obviously it's a lot higher than the corn price, but it was spiking even more. And I haven't looked at markets this morning, you obviously have, but my guess is corn is really spiking because there's already a problem with global corn supplies anyways. And the worrying thing about corn is, of course, it's, think about the three or four major commodities, wheat, corn, soybeans, and I would add rice in there. Wheat and what the rest of the world calls maize and rice are important commodities for subsistence consumers in emerging economies. And so, Ukraine exports a lot to the Middle East, to Africa, Middle East, particularly to Egypt, I believe, for wheat. Corn obviously going to China and other parts of Southern Asia. So the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization have been expressing a lot of concern about global food prices over the past 6 or 7 months. Initially in the pandemic, food prices didn't really start going up on world markets, but the combination of these supply shocks on the wheat side, to some extent on the corn and soybean side down in Latin America, with some drought conditions in Brazil and Argentina, and then of course the demand side shocks, both through global value chains and the fact that the US economy is running pretty hot and people want to spend money, and it's affecting commodity prices across the board, and they're feeding into food price inflation. So I think we're going to see higher domestic food price inflation, especially in Europe, which is highly dependent on natural gas coming from Russia. And I think the Germans, I think, have already cut off the new gas line going under the Baltic Sea, which that's one of Russia's important economic exports is gas. And along with the input price surge and now the price surge, I think that I think this is just going to exacerbate both world food prices and domestic food prices, both here and in Europe. Beyond that, Russia's a big exporter of other commodities, but it's surprising that Russia's not as big an economy as you might think. So it's going to be interesting to see how, beyond ag and some other commodities, how this pans out. I mean, I think this morning Russian stock market trading has been suspended, and I believe the Russian ruble has tumbled big time. So I think the Russian economy will be hurting itself really badly. And as I understand, it was already in a pretty bad place even before Putin started threatening the Ukraine. So I think there's a big economic downside potentially to Russia from sanctions and the negative spillovers of the invasion. So that was a long answer to a short question. I'm sorry.
Well, but you mentioned double-edged sword. The other side of that sword, you mentioned inputs and fertilizers. We're seeing shortages here now already with those types of inputs for the 2022 season. Do you see that being escalated by what we're seeing in Ukraine now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way it probably is going to work is if they cut off the gas supplies or gas is in short supply, gas is a major feedstock for producing fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers, which of course is the most important um, chemical fertilizer that we use here in Ohio, United States, and broadly in Western Europe and elsewhere. I think that's mostly going to affect feedstock prices to European fertilizer manufacturers. So that's going to push up fertilizer prices in Europe, which then, necessarily in a global market will feed into, whoever trades in fertilizers is going to start looking for fertilizers elsewhere in the world market, and then that's just going to feed it. In other words, this is a big enough feedstock shock that it'll affect world prices of fertilizers, which will then feed back into the US market. So, we know that fertilizer prices spiked pretty high last year, and I guess that's going to continue. I don't know, I couldn't tell you exactly how much because I don't follow that market really extensively, but yeah, I think, we already had short supply of fertilizers last year. This tells me we're going to have even shorter supplies this year. So that's why I called it a double-edged sword. Farmers may benefit on the corn price, wheat price end. I'm not sure what I could tell you about soybeans. I think that's probably more going to be driven by what's happening in Latin America and China than particularly the Ukraine. But then you're going to get this, we're going to just have a second round of inputs price squeezes. So, that obviously is going to affect farm gate margins. So we'll have to see precisely how much that is going to work through. You need to talk to my colleagues like Seung-Ki Lee and Barry Ward follows fertilizer markets a lot more closely than I do. But I'm sort of looking at it from a global standpoint, and I don't see, the really bad things here are food prices, food security issues in the emerging world, and input prices. And there's some, potentially optimistic things for U.S. farmers and exporters, but there's a lot of negative things on the downside risk side as well, I think.
Well, of course, we'll reach out to your colleagues too, but I knew the first person to call was Dr. Ian Sheldon, professor in Anderson's Chair of Agricultural Marketing, Trade, and Policy at Ohio State's Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics. Thank you so much for taking time for us under these really tough circumstances. It's really important information for our members to know and what they need to watch for as this crisis continues. Thank you.
Okay, you're most welcome. Thank you very much for asking me to be on today.